My daughter's voice cut through the music. "You weren't invited, Mom. Leave." Guests turned, eyes flicking between us. My chest tightened, but I steadied myself. I'd survived worse storms. Instead of walking out, I reached into my bag and touched the deed that proved the ground under her feet was mine. This wasn't the end of my day. It was the beginning of hers unraveling. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. The morning started like any other, quiet, steady, and predictable. I padded across my kitchen floor in my slippers, the faint creak of the wood under my feet as familiar as the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the pot. Outside my front window, the cherry blossom tree in my yard had just started to blush with pink petals, a sure sign that spring was finally nudging winter aside. My little street in suburban Illinois was hushed, save for the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional bark of the neighbor's retriever. I settled into my chair at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread before me, flipping straight to the local section. But it wasn't the headlines that caught my attention. It was the stack of mail beside me, mostly bills and supermarket flyers. Nestled between them was an ivory-colored envelope, heavier than the rest, with my address written in looping, embossed script. No return address, just a faint embossed emblem in the top left corner, a design I couldn't place but seemed deliberately formal. My heart gave a small, hopeful jump. I'd heard murmurs, half-whispered updates from extended family, that my daughter Thalassa's wedding was coming up. She hadn't spoken to me about it directly, but I'd been expecting, maybe even craving, that official invitation. I traced the edge of the envelope with my thumb before sliding a letter opener beneath the flap. Inside was a thick card with elegant lettering announcing the union of Thalassa Miller and her fiancé. I scanned the details, the date, the venue, the RSVP instructions, before my eyes caught on the salutation, addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Miller. My husband had been gone for nearly a decade, and yet here his name was, printed cleanly, while mine was conspicuously absent. I flipped the card over, as if some hidden message might be on the back. There was nothing, just a pristine white surface, the kind that reflected light in a way that made you squint. My name wasn't anywhere, not in the address line, not in the RSVP section, nowhere. Shock settled over me, not as a sudden blow but as a slow tightening in my chest. You can't accidentally forget your own mother's name. I placed the card on the table, staring at it as my coffee cooled beside me. The last time Thalassa and I spoke, her tone had been clipped, efficient, like a business call she couldn't wait to end. I'd chalked it up to her busy schedule as an event planner in Chicago. But this omission felt deliberate. You know, respect in a family is like air. Once it's gone, it's hard to breathe. That's something my father used to say, and it rang in my ears now. The idea of other family members opening their own invitations, seeing my absence, imagining I wasn't even considered, it stung more than I wanted to admit. And it wasn't the first time. I remembered last Thanksgiving when she'd hosted dinner and forgotten to mention it until the day after. Or the time she'd introduced me to her friends simply as Lou Costa's grandma, skipping my name entirely. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Still, old habits die hard. I've always believed in giving people a chance to show grace before making a judgment. So I decided I'd send her a gift, a peace offering of sorts. In my bedroom, I pulled open the top drawer of my dresser and took out a small, velvet-lined box. Inside was a vintage silver locket that had belonged to my grandmother. I remembered the way it used to catch the light when she wore it on Sundays, the tiny hinge that clicked shut with a sound as satisfying as the turn of a key. I'd planned to pass it down to Thalassa eventually, and perhaps this was the moment. I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper, slid it into a small gift box, and tied it with a satin ribbon. Then I wrote a note on thick stationery. Thalassa, I wish you joy and happiness in your marriage. May this locket bring you the same strength and grace it brought to the women before you. I drove to the post office and paid extra for overnight courier service, making sure it would arrive before her bridal shower. When I got home, I pinned the tracking receipt to the fridge, a quiet reminder to myself that I'd done my part. The measure of a person isn't how they act when things are good, but how they respond when they're wrong. That was another saying I'd clung to over the years. I hoped she'd respond well. Days went by. No acknowledgement, no phone call, not even a text from Lucasta, my granddaughter, who usually sent me quick updates about school or her latest baking experiments. Then one evening, as I sat scrolling through my phone, I saw photos from the bridal shower on social media. There was Thalassa, glowing in a cream dress, surrounded by friends and family. The display table of gifts was piled high, colorful bags, shiny boxes, overflowing bouquets. But my gift wasn't there, not in the background, not in her hands, not anywhere. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the like button before I set the phone down. The pieces began to fit together in a way I didn't like. My name missing from the invitation. My gift absent from the shower. It wasn't about oversight. It was about exclusion. When a crack appears in the foundation, the whole house will shift. That thought settled in my mind like a weight. My voice stayed calm, my demeanor steady, but inside, something had shifted too. That night, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but the voice on the voicemail was familiar, my distant cousin Marlene, who rarely called unless she had news worth sharing. "Hey, Eudora, I heard something strange at the wedding rehearsal dinner. You might want to sit down before I tell you." I lowered myself into my favorite armchair, the one with the worn armrests and the floral cushion. My fingers curled around the wood, steadying myself for whatever she was about to say. If they think I'm going to sit quietly in the shadows, they've mistaken the wrong woman. And that call was the spark that lit the fire. 2 days after that strange voicemail from Vian, the morning light stretched lazily across my living room floor, painting long golden rectangles over the rug. The kettle on the stove had just started its low, familiar rumble when the phone rang. I recognized her number instantly. I let it ring twice, long enough to collect myself, before picking up. "Morning, Eudora," she said, her voice lower than usual, almost as if she'd been rehearsing. "You got a minute?" Something in her tone told me this wasn't a friendly catch-up. "Go ahead," I replied, keeping my voice even. She hesitated. I heard something at the rehearsal dinner." "From who?" "Doesn't matter who. But I was near enough when Thalassa was talking to the planner. Clear as day, she said." Vian's breath caught for a moment. "Make sure Mom's name is nowhere on the list. Not the main list, not the backup list." "Nowhere." I gripped the phone tighter, though my voice stayed steady. "I see. Eudora, I didn't want to call. You did right to tell me." My tone was calm, but inside it was as though someone had poured ice water down my spine. In my world, you don't give someone the satisfaction of hearing you crack. There's an old saying, you don't wash your dirty laundry in public. My laundry would stay right where I wanted it, until I decided otherwise. "Vian," I said after a beat. "Can you meet me tomorrow? Same place as always." "The diner?" "Yes, noon." And just like that, the plan in my mind began to take shape. The next day, the familiar chime of the diner door greeted me as I stepped inside. The scent of fried bacon and fresh coffee wrapped around me like an old quilt. I spotted Vian in a corner booth, her hair piled high and her reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose. She slid a manila envelope across the table before I'd even sat down. "Take a look." Inside was a printed seating chart, rows and columns neatly typed out, each name in its place. My eyes scanned down the page to where I should have been seated. Only I wasn't there. In my spot was Aunt Beverly, a woman I hadn't seen in over a decade and who had once told me my pound cake was a little too dry at a family reunion. I kept my face neutral, but my coffee spoon clinked a little too hard against the ceramic mug. "They're rewriting the family story, Eudora," Vian said, her eyes sharp. And you're not in it. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue. Sometimes, I said quietly, the best move is the one no one sees coming. Vian leaned in, her voice dropping. What are you planning? I offered a small, knowing smile. Something that won't be on any list. Driving home, I took the long route. It brought me past the historic stone building that would host the wedding. I knew it well. Too well. The facade still carried the carved date from 1912, and the arched windows gleamed under the afternoon sun. Most people saw an old venue. I saw an investment I'd purchased quietly years ago under a holding company no one connected to me. It had been part of my retirement portfolio, my little safety net. Ownership is 9/10 of the law, my father used to say, and that building was mine in every legal sense that mattered. As I slowed, I noticed staff carrying in boxes, white lilies, gold-trimmed linens, crates of glassware. My eyes narrowed. A glint of silver caught the sunlight. It took me a second, but I recognized the intricate engraving along the rim. Those were my grandmother's bowls. They'd been in my attic, wrapped in layers of newspaper. I hadn't lent them to anyone. I parked a block away and watched for several minutes, memorizing faces, noting the catering company's logo on the truck. If they were going to borrow from me without asking, I'd be taking notes. Back at home, I didn't waste time. I pulled a wide accordion folder from my cabinet and labeled a fresh section. Wedding. Receipts, photographs, property deeds, all went in. I printed out a copy of the venue's ownership records. Then I laid out pictures of the silver bowls from the last time I'd inventoried the attic. Once everything was in neat order, I called Caius Brunel, my attorney. Hypothetically speaking, I began, what would happen if an event was being held on property I own without proper authorization? Hypothetically, he said, a smile audible in his voice. Hypothetically. Well, hypothetically, the owner could set conditions, revoke permissions, or end the event entirely. Good to know. I kept my tone light, as though we were chatting about gardening. Should I prepare any paperwork? Not yet, I said. I'm not in a rush. There's a truth I've learned over the years. Revenge is like a well-brewed tea. It needs time to steep. Pull it too soon, and you've wasted the leaves. That evening, as the sun dipped low, my phone chimed. A group text from various cousins and distant relatives lit up the screen, photos from the rehearsal dinner. I swiped through them slowly, noting the faces, the laughter, and then I saw them. The centerpieces on each table, filled with fresh roses. The vessels holding them were unmistakable. My antique silver bowls, the very ones I'd spotted earlier that day. No one had asked. No one had even mentioned it. I set the phone down gently, my fingertips drumming against the armrest. If they've set the stage, I murmured to the empty room, they'd better be ready for the show. My lips curled into a thin smile. And this time, I said softly, I'll be the one writing the guest list. The next morning came too soon. I was awake before the sun had fully risen, lying in bed staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling that I'd memorized over the years. The words from yesterday, "Make sure Mom's name is nowhere on the list," echoed in my head like a stubborn melody that refused to fade. No amount of shifting in bed could drown them out. I finally swung my legs over the side, wincing at the cool air that met my bare feet. In the kitchen, the quiet was thick. The old percolator sputtered to life, filling the air with the familiar scent of strong coffee. I sat at the small table, hands wrapped around the mug, watching steam curl upward. This house used to hum with noise. Dane's radio playing in the garage, the lass's voice calling out from the hallway. Now the silence pressed in from every wall. People say, silence speaks louder than words. And this morning, mine screamed. As I stirred sugar into my coffee, I began tracing the steps backward, 15 years, maybe more, trying to see where the coldness started. It wasn't a single moment, it was a slow erosion, and if I was honest, I'd let it happen. 15 years ago, we stood on the grassy quad of Thalassa's University, sunlight bouncing off the crimson gowns of hundreds of graduates. Dane was grinning from ear to ear, waving at her from the crowd. I had worked double shifts for months to help pay for her books, skipped vacations, and cooked every meal from scratch to save money. When she stepped up to the podium as one of the valedictorians, my chest swelled with pride, but as she spoke, something inside me shifted. "I owe everything to my father," she said, her voice strong. "He's the reason I'm here today." The applause roared. She didn't glance my way, not once. My smile froze, and I clapped along, pretending it didn't sting. After the ceremony, Dane tried to smooth it over, his arm slipping around my shoulders. "She's young," he whispered. "She doesn't realize how it sounds." But I noticed she avoided my gaze, busy posing for pictures with her friends and professors. Later, as I headed toward the parking lot, I caught her voice behind me. She was talking to a friend, laughter in her tone. "Mom's... well, she's old-fashioned. Doesn't get how the world works now." My hands tightened around the strap of my purse. I wanted to turn around, to ask her what exactly she meant. Instead, I kept walking, telling myself time would smooth the edges. It didn't. 7 years ago, the air in our house was heavy with antiseptic and worry. Dane was sick, too sick for either of us to pretend it was temporary. I called Thalassa one evening after he'd fallen in the hallway. My voice shook as I explained I needed her help. "I can't, Mom," she said, her voice clipped. "Work's crazy right now. I'll send Cousin Maribel over." Maribel was kind, but she wasn't family in the way Dane needed. That night, I sat by his bed, listening to him breathe, the sound ragged and uneven. After Dane passed, she came to the funeral, but her eyes seemed fixed somewhere beyond me. People often say, funerals don't end family feuds, they often ignite them. I learned the truth of that when she left early, citing an early meeting the next day. Contact between us trickled down to rare holiday calls, sometimes just a text with no punctuation, no warmth. Back in the present, I stood in the garden, pruning the last of the summer roses. The air was crisp, and the thorns bit at my gloves as if reminding me that beauty often hides sharp edges. Each memory replayed in my mind, threading itself into the bigger picture. Her latest insult wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of years of quiet cuts. I set down the clippers, staring at the empty bird bath in the center of the yard. I'd been patient, believing that staying out of the way might preserve some fragment of our relationship. But patience had turned into erasure. And I wasn't going to sit quietly in the corner of my own life anymore. Timing mattered. If I was going to reclaim my place, it would be in a way that no one saw coming. I'd waited this long. A little longer would only sharpen the impact. "They may have erased me from the program," I murmured, brushing dirt from my hands, "but I'm still writing the ending." Inside, I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and began listing what I knew and what she didn't. The venue was mine, bought outright years ago when the previous owner fell into debt. There were property loans she had no idea I'd issued to members of the extended family, loans that could be called in at any time. And then there were the heirlooms, silver bowls, lace tablecloths, a mahogany sideboard she'd borrowed and never returned. Surprise would be my greatest weapon. No warnings, no hints. Let her think she'd succeeded. The sweeter the illusion, the sharper the break when it shattered. I wandered into the living room where an old photograph of Dane sat on the mantel. He was leaning against the hood of his truck, smiling like he always did when he thought no one was watching. I picked it up, my thumb brushing the glass. "You'd want me to stand my ground," I whispered, my voice steady. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do." A vibration rattled the phone on the coffee table. I glanced down, a number I didn't recognize, but the text preview read, "This is Marlene, the wedding planner. We need to talk." I set the photograph back in its place, a slow smile spreading across my face. And this time, I said to the empty room. I won't be the one left outside. The morning light poured into my kitchen in a way that made the edges of the countertop glow. The coffee pot gurgled softly, filling the air with the scent of dark roast. I was halfway through buttering a slice of toast when the shrill ring of my old landline broke the silence. That phone hardly ever rang anymore. Most people used my cell. My first thought was that it must be a telemarketer, but something in me hesitated before dismissing it. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked up the receiver. Hello? Good morning, Mrs. Miller? A woman's voice, brisk but polite, came through the line. This is Vivian Carter, assistant to the wedding planner for the Baxter Richards wedding. My grip on the receiver tightened just enough for my knuckles to pale. She didn't say your daughter's wedding, which was telling. Yes, I'm here, I replied, keeping my voice level, neutral. There's been a minor scheduling change involving the venue, Vivian continued. I just wanted to confirm with you directly. Minor. In my experience, people only use that word when they meant anything but. I leaned back against the counter, letting her voice play on while I mentally shifted gears. Opportunities didn't often walk into your kitchen uninvited. My father's words floated back from decades ago. Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Well, I said evenly, I'm listening. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been standing in the produce aisle of Whitman's grocery, squinting at a pile of Roma tomatoes that looked more like they belonged in compost. That's when I heard a familiar laugh, a high, lilting trill I hadn't heard in years. Eudora, my word, it's been ages! Mrs. Lorraine Baxter, the groom's aunt, was standing there with a basket of lemons and a wide-brimmed straw hat perched on her head. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, how's the weather, how's your health, until she leaned in conspiratorially. This wedding must be costing a fortune, she said with a wink, but I suppose you're used to that. You've always been so generous. I didn't correct her. Instead, I felt a slow, measured warmth rise inside me, so some of the guests still thought I was bankrolling the whole thing. That was valuable. Perception could be a sharper weapon than any outright confrontation. Well, Lorraine, I replied, plucking the least bruised tomato from the pile. Sometimes the loudest move is silence until the right moment. She chuckled as if I'd made a joke, and I let her. Inside, I'd already tucked that piece of information away, knowing it might be worth far more than the produce I left with that day. Back in my kitchen, Vivian's voice cut through my thoughts. So, regarding your payment schedule for the venue, will it remain the same despite the seating chart change? My mind tripped over that phrase. Seating chart change? That was the first I'd heard of it. I hadn't been told I had a seat at all. The muscles in my jaw stayed loose even as my thoughts sharpened like the edge of a blade. Seating chart? I asked, in a tone that was all airy curiosity. Oh, I wasn't told I had a seat. There was a pause, the kind that hums with realization. Oh, well, yes, you're on the guest list, of course, Vivian stammered. It's just, we're reconfiguring things for space. I see, I said lightly, as though she'd just told me the flowers were being switched from roses to lilies. But inside, I was noting every word, every hesitation. Whatever this change was, it wasn't about space. It was about removing me further from the picture. She seemed to realize she'd overstepped, fumbling to steer the conversation back to payment. I didn't offer her a rope. Sometimes letting someone twist a little told you more than any direct question could. I'll need to review the contract before confirming anything, I said warmly, the same tone I used when offering a neighbor a slice of pie I had no intention of actually baking. Oh, of course, Vivian replied, sounding relieved to have a clear next step. The moment I hung up, I reached for my leather-bound planner and flipped to the back where I kept keynotes. The venue contract was still under my name. That meant certain rights I doubted anyone on their side had bothered to reread. Control the space, control the story. That phrase wrote itself in my head as I jotted it down. I thought about the public nature of a wedding, the guest list full of people who assumed one version of events. How easy it would be to let that assumption breathe until it worked entirely in my favor. I sipped my coffee slowly, tasting the slight bitterness, and smiled. Now I had a foothold inside the event, and they'd never even noticed the door opening. After the call, I stepped out into my garden. The late morning air was warm, and the scent of blooming roses rolled over me like a familiar blanket. I moved among the rows, shears in hand, snipping a wayward stem here, deadheading a bloom there. My father's voice came back again from the time he taught me to plant my first rose bush. If they think you're out, that's when you walk back in. The more I thought about it, the more the plan took shape. I'd make a visit to the venue under the pretense of a routine owner's inspection. I'd walk through every inch, eyes open for leverage, ears tuned for gossip. I tilted my face toward the sun, feeling its heat on my cheeks, and murmured, "They'll see me before they hear me." A mockingbird hopped along the fence, watching me as if it sensed the shift in my mood. I clipped the last rose, set it in my basket, and turned toward the house. "And when they do," I said under my breath, "it won't be by accident." The following morning, I pulled into the venue's gravel lot with the same ease I'd parked there 100 times before. The old oak trees lining the driveway were already catching the mid-morning sun, their shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. I'd dressed for the part, pressed slacks, a soft cashmere sweater, and a silk scarf knotted just so. Anyone watching would see a poised woman coming in for a friendly owner's check, not a storm in a teacup. The front desk staff stood at attention as I walked in, their smiles polite but tight. A young man I didn't recognize stepped forward. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller. Can we help you?" "Yes," I said, matching his smile. "I'm here for a routine walkthrough. You know, making sure every corner is ready for the big day." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice as if sharing a secret. "If I own the barn, I get to see every stall." His Adam's apple bobbed. "Of course, ma'am." The morning light poured into the grand lobby, catching on the marble floor like liquid gold. A couple of staff members exchanged glances, the kind people do when they've been told to keep you away from something. That only sharpened my curiosity. Vivian Carter appeared from the hallway, clipboard in hand, her smile stretched like plastic wrap. "Mrs. Miller." "What a surprise!" "Oh, I doubt that," I replied gently. She guided me toward a side table in the reception hall. A large sheet of paper, mostly hidden under catering invoices, caught my eye. "What's this?" I asked, as if I hadn't already guessed. "Oh, just preliminary notes for the seating arrangement," she said, her pen tapping nervously. "Mind if I take a look?" "It's really not final," she began, but I'd already leaned in far enough to catch the truth. My name was nowhere. I straightened, keeping my face unreadable. "Interesting choice," I said lightly. "I'll have to see how that plays out." Vivian's smile faltered. "Like I said, it's just a draft." I let the moment pass without further comment, strolling toward the ballroom. Inside, the air was heavy with the perfume of fresh flowers. Tall arrangements of blush roses and white hydrangeas stood at each corner, unmistakably the exact custom package I'd paid for months ago. I touched one of the ribbons tied around a vase, the satin still cool from storage. "They're stunning," I told a young woman arranging a centerpiece. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. These were covered in the first payment you made, so we were able to get them early," she said without hesitation. I glanced at her, letting a slow smile curl across my lips. Proof. They might have erased me from the seating chart, but my hand was still in every detail they displayed. Inside, a calm satisfaction settled in. They couldn't uninvite the foundation the whole house sat on. From there, I asked for access to the bridal prep suite. Vivian hesitated, then nodded to one of the staff to unlock the door. Inside, the space was draped in ivory linens and scattered with monogrammed robes, embroidered with the bride's new initials. On the counter, a chilled bottle of imported champagne sat next to a silver tray of macarons. I ran my fingers over the cork's wire cage. I knew the vendor. I'd recommended them last year for another event, another quiet thread connecting me to this day. In the groom's lounge, the scent of cedar and leather hung in the air. A pair of polished cufflinks rested on the coffee table, the brand name engraved on the inside. Another vendor I'd once introduced to the family. I cataloged each connection like pearls on a string, knowing they could be traced back through contracts and invoices. Through it all, I kept my tone light, asking after the staff's families, complimenting their work. People talk more when they feel safe. By the time I left each room, I had a mental inventory of every item that tied them to me. Back in the lobby, I paused near the double doors. Vivian joined me, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Thank you for showing me around," I said, my voice smooth. "It's good to know where my investments are being enjoyed." Her cheeks flushed. "We appreciate your support, Mrs. Miller." "I'm sure you do." I didn't rush my exit. Instead, I moved slowly through the space, letting my presence register with each staff member and the few early guests trickling in. A couple of them whispered to each other, casting curious glances my way. Good. As I stepped out into the sharp midday light, I slipped on my sunglasses and took a deep breath. They thought my quiet meant retreat. They'd mistaken silence for surrender. That was their first mistake. The second, they were about to find out. The next morning, I sat in my home office with a steaming mug of black coffee, the kind that bites just enough to wake the mind. The desk in front of me was crowded with manila folders, but the one I wanted was buried at the back, under tax records and last year's garden club minutes. When I finally slid it free, the embossed logo of the venue caught the light, my original contract. I'd signed it years ago, back when I was more involved with the place than I am now. Most people skim these things, but I'd been in enough business rooms to know where the real power hides. My fingers traced each page until I found it, the clause giving me final approval over any and all material changes to an event I funded, right down to guest access. Then, 3 pages in, there it was. Owner's veto. Rarely used, rarely noticed. I'd fought for that line in a late-night meeting when everyone else just wanted to go home. I grabbed a sticky note and marked the sections like breadcrumbs, highlighting phrases that could stop a wedding in its tracks. They thought I was just a name on a deed, an inconvenient relative with no real say. But I wasn't a bystander. I was the signature that made the music play. I picked up the phone and dialed the venue's main office. A receptionist answered, her tone chipper until I asked for Graham Price, the general manager. There was a pause, too long to be casual, before she put me on hold. "Mrs. Miller," a man's voice finally came on, smooth but guarded. "I understand you wanted to speak with me?" "Yes, Graham. I've been reviewing our contract and noticed a few oversights that will need correcting before the wedding moves forward." There was the faintest inhale, the kind that means someone's trying not to react. "I see. Perhaps you could email the details?" "No," I said gently. "This is better done in person. I'll bring the paperwork. You'll want to read it twice." He hesitated, but in the end agreed to meet that afternoon. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, calculating the risk of ignoring me. By 2 o'clock, I was back at the venue, this time with a leather-bound binder in hand. Every page was tabbed and highlighted in a rainbow of precision. Graham met me in his office, a polished room with framed photos of charity galas lining the walls. He shook my hand, his grip firm, his smile polite. As he read, I watched his eyes flicker over the clauses. I didn't need to say much. The words were all there in black and white. Halfway through, the door opened and in swept Vivian, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Oh, Mrs. Miller," she said, her tone a shade too bright. "Vivian," I replied, my voice as warm as winter sunlight. "We were just going over the agreement. It seems my removal from the guest list would be in direct violation of these terms, particularly those tied to my financial contributions." Vivian's smile tightened, but she stayed silent. Graham cleared his throat. "I understand your concerns. We'll Review our options. Please do, I said, sliding the binder toward him. I'm sure you'll find them limited. Before I left, I paused at the doorway. One more thing, I said lightly. Any breach of this contract could result in delays. And delays, well, they tend to draw attention. The words landed. Vivian's posture stiffened. She knew exactly what kind of gossip could start swirling if people thought the wedding was in trouble. Graham's expression didn't change, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't just about a seating chart anymore. I thanked them for their time, shaking hands like a diplomat after a negotiation that had gone my way. As I walked back to my car, I felt it settle in me. The first real shift in power. The venue now saw me as a deciding factor, not a footnote. Paperwork, I thought, is just a polite way to change the game. That evening, just after dinner, the phone rang. Graham's voice came through, softer now, with an edge of deference. Mrs. Miller, I wanted to let you know we'll be accommodating your presence at the wedding. Of course, the details can be worked out as we move closer to the date. I leaned back in my chair, letting him talk. The tone was different now. No guarded neutrality, just careful courtesy. Thank you, Graham, I said warmly. I appreciate your understanding. When I hung up, I stared out the window at the darkened street. Now that I had my seat back, it was time to decide exactly how I'd use it. By mid-morning, I was back at my dining table, the sunlight spilling across a neat stack of papers. On top sat the approved guest list that had arrived in my inbox overnight, courtesy of the wedding planner. I smoothed it out and began scanning the names slowly, line by line, with the same focus I used to balance company budgets. At first glance, it was what you'd expect. Family, a few neighbors, and the predictable social circle of my son and his fiancée. But the longer I looked, the more glaring the omissions became. People who had stood by our family through decades of highs and lows. Friends who had sent casseroles when my husband passed, or who'd been at every charity auction I chaired. A couple of local figures who, if they weren't there, would notice and talk. That was when the idea took root. A wedding isn't just about who shows up, it's about who can't stop talking afterward. Add the right people and you don't just fill seats, you change the weather in the room. I reached for a legal pad and started writing a new column. Supplemental guest list. With my contract rights still fresh in my mind, I knew I could justify every name. And these weren't just friends. They were people whose presence would subtly tip the balance of attention away from certain family members and toward me. I picked up the phone and dialed Cynthia Rowe. She'd been my friend since our daughters were in kindergarten, a woman whose smile could open doors and whose words could close them just as fast. Eudora, she answered, her voice warm and curious. To what do I owe this pleasure before lunch? I need your eyes on something, I said. And your discretion. Half an hour later, we were tucked into the back booth of the cafe we'd claimed as ours for years. The waitress didn't even ask for our order. 2 cappuccinos and a plate of almond biscotti appeared like clockwork. I slid the guest list across to her. She read it once, frowned, then read it again. Well, she said, this is sparse and strategic in the wrong way. Exactly. I'm thinking of balancing the room, I told her, outlining the additions I'd been considering. Cynthia's eyes twinkled. Oh, I can help with this. I know 3 people off the top of my head who would not only attend, but make an entrance. We went through names, retired judges, foundation donors, a beloved choir director whose presence could make even the most cynical smile. Cynthia leaned in, lowering her voice, and, of course, a few who might make certain relatives just a little uneasy. I smiled. With pleasure. And a little mischief? With great pleasure, she corrected. That afternoon, I sat at my desk drafting a formal addendum to the guest list. The language was polite but firm, citing the exact sections of the contract that granted me the authority to make such adjustments. I printed a draft and decided it needed more weight. Not metaphorical weight, actual tactile weight. The local print shop was quiet when I walked in, the scent of fresh ink clinging to the air. I handed the document to the young man behind the counter and asked for it on embossed ivory stationery with raised lettering. He whistled softly as he read it. "This is official." "It needs to be," I replied. "People take paper seriously when it feels expensive." Within the hour, I had a packet in a navy envelope, my name embossed at the top. I drove straight to the venue, bypassing the front desk and asking for the liaison by name. She met me in the hallway, her expression guarded. "This," I said, handing her the envelope, "is an addendum to the guest list. Please see that it's integrated immediately." She opened it right there, scanning the neat lines of names, her brows lifted. "This will change the seating chart entirely." "Exactly," I said, smiling just enough to be polite. By the next morning, the ripples had already begun. In a town like ours, word didn't travel, it sprinted. I got 2 calls before breakfast from distant cousins who just happened to be wondering if I knew anything about the new guest names floating around. I gave them the same vague answer. "Oh, just making sure everyone feels welcome." Cynthia called later, her voice bubbling. "You should know that half the people you added are over the moon. Mrs. Porter's already planning her outfit. She told me she hasn't bought a hat in 10 years, but for this, she will." I pictured the faces at that reception, the subtle nods, the whispered asides. They'd invited me back to my seat, but now I was deciding who sat around me. The thought was deeply satisfying, not because it was petty, but because it was deliberate. This was strategy with a smile. Late that afternoon, my phone lit up with the wedding planner's name. I answered with the same even tone I'd been using all week. "Mrs. Miller," she began, tight and businesslike, "I'm calling to confirm that the additional guests you submitted will be accommodated. We're adjusting the seating accordingly." "That's good to hear," I said. "Thank you for your cooperation." We exchanged a few more pleasantries before hanging up. I set the phone down and let the quiet of the house settle around me. The power dynamic had shifted again, and this time, it was more than a seat. It was the atmosphere, the narrative, the story people would tell long after the last toast. If they thought the guest list was my endgame, they hadn't been paying attention. The morning after my addendum had been accepted, I drove to the venue for what the email had called a routine update on preparations. Routine. That word always makes me suspicious. People use it when they're either hiding something or underestimating you. The venue's event office sat at the far end of a sunlit corridor, its glass door etched with swirling vines. The manager, a tall man in a navy blazer whose name I kept forgetting, stood when I entered. "Mrs. Miller, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing to the large table at the center of the room. Spread across it was the seating chart, a wide sheet with neat lines and miniature table diagrams, each circled with tiny printed names. I stepped closer. There were my guests, all right, every one of them from the list I'd added. Only they'd been gathered together like cattle in the back left corner, far from the dance floor, far from the couple's table, far from any place where their voices would naturally carry. I smiled thinly, keeping my voice light. "Interesting arrangement. You've grouped them together. Was that the couple's request?" He hesitated, then nodded. "They felt it might be more comfortable." Comfortable. That was the polite word for sidelined. In my mind, I could already see Mr. Palmer, former Rotary Club president, holding court even from the farthest table. If they thought distance would dull influence, they'd never seen him in action. "Well," I said, picking up the sheet and scanning it like a surgeon reading a chart, "I'd like a copy to review at home. I'll make notes for accessibility and such." "Of course," he said, sliding a crisp duplicate into a folder and handing it to me. That afternoon, Cynthia arrived at my house with her ever-present leather tote. We cleared the dining table, spreading out the chart like a battle map. I fetched my fine-point pen and a stack of sticky notes. All right, I said. Let's move some troops. We started with the most influential, placing Mr. Palmer and his wife 2 tables away from the couple, close enough to catch attention without appearing staged. The retired judge went near the dance floor, flanked by 2 of the town's most enthusiastic storytellers. Our beloved choir director? She got a seat next to a bridesmaid's aunt who could never resist sharing every scrap of gossip she overheard. Cynthia tapped her pen against the paper, eyes gleaming. You're not rearranging seats, you're orchestrating an entire evening. Exactly, I said, but the battle will be won with champagne and charm, not swords. By the time we finished, the chart looked the same to an untrained eye, but every move had purpose. Each ally was positioned where their presence could ripple outward without me lifting a finger during the reception. The next morning, I dressed in my navy skirt suit, the one that said I meant business without shouting it, and returned to the venue. The manager was meeting with a caterer's assistant when I arrived, but he stepped aside as I approached. I have a few adjustments to request, I said, handing him a sealed envelope. Inside was my revised chart, along with a short, courteous letter. I'd written it with just enough warmth to seem gracious, but laced it with words like accessibility and honoring long-standing friendships. He opened it, reading silently. When he got to the 3rd page, his brows rose. This is extensive. It's all within the terms of my agreement, I replied smoothly. He nodded slowly, setting the papers on his desk. We'll need to reprint the name cards and possibly adjust the menu layouts. I'll cover the cost, I said, sliding a check across the desk before he could protest. That small gesture wasn't just about money, it was about leaving no excuse for delay. The calls started 2 days later. A cousin rang first, his tone half joking. I heard I'm suddenly closer to the action. Should I be flattered or worried? Flattered, I said, chuckling softly. I just thought you'd enjoy being near the dance floor. Cynthia reported from her end, too. 2 of your newly repositioned guests are thrilled, she told me over the phone. One's already practicing a toast, the other's planning a story to tell about you. Even the groom's side seemed unsettled. A clipped voicemail from his aunt landed in my inbox. I don't know what's going on, but it feels different. That was the beauty of it. No one could put their finger on why, but the undercurrent had shifted. I poured myself a cup of tea one evening and stood by the window, watching the late summer sky fade. Let them think it was kindness. By the time they realized, the night would be over, and the story would have already taken root in the minds of everyone who mattered. That night, over a quiet dinner at my own table, I reviewed my mental checklist. Most of the pieces were in place now, guests secured, seating arranged, the flow of conversation set to drift exactly where I wanted it. I could hear my late husband's voice in my head, the way he used to sound when teaching our kids chess. Position is everything, in chess and in life. Sometimes you win before the other side even sees the checkmate. I set my fork down, feeling the weight of his words. They thought they had me in the corner. They forgot I built the board. The sky had the soft, pearly light of late afternoon when I pulled into the venue's circular driveway. The rehearsal was already in motion, cars parked in neat rows, laughter and the occasional burst of music drifting from the open doors of the main hall. I'd chosen my outfit with care. A muted slate blue dress, simple pearl earrings, and low heels. Nothing flashy. The sort of attire that told people I was present but not competing for the spotlight. As I stepped inside, conversations dimmed just enough for me to notice. A few heads turned. Whispers skated through the air like quick gusts of wind. The bride stood near the front, clutching a clipboard a little too tightly. She offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The groom's gaze flitted past me, fixing itself on some imaginary point in the far corner. I moved slowly through the space, greeting the guests I had intentionally placed near key tables for tomorrow. Mr. Palmer clasped my hand warmly, his wife leaning in with a conspiratorial grin. I noticed the new seating plan had already begun to take physical shape, tables labeled, name cards tentatively set in place. My allies were exactly where I had positioned them, islands in a sea of faces, ready to anchor the evening when the currents shifted. "Lovely setup," I murmured to a passing usher, my tone friendly, my eyes already calculating angles and proximity. As the walkthrough began, the officiant called for everyone to take their places. I slipped into a seat at the edge, perfectly positioned to observe without interfering. The groom's mother was chatting animatedly with Mr. Palmer, who was doing an excellent job of appearing interested while subtly steering the conversation toward family stories that painted me in a warm light. Across the aisle, the choir director was deep in conversation with one of the groom's cousins, their heads bent close together. The connection looked casual, but I knew better. Seeds had been planted, and already roots were forming beneath the surface. I watched the bride's maid of honor, tall with a careful posture, glancing toward me now and then. Her smile to the bride seemed tighter each time, like she was sensing a shift in the room she couldn't quite name. Influence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits quietly, smiling from the next chair over, until people forget where the warmth came from. I kept my demeanor light, exchanging pleasantries, offering compliments about the decor, and never once making a move that could be mistaken for direct maneuvering. Cynthia, standing by the back doors, caught my eye and made a small motion, a tilt of her head toward the maid of honor. I nodded once, filing it away. When the officiant called for a break, I slipped outside into the courtyard. The air was cooler there, scented faintly with jasmine from the trellises along the walls. I'd only taken 2 steps toward the stone bench when the groom's aunt appeared, her heels clicking on the flagstones. "I have to say," she began with a half-smile, "it's refreshing to see the seating this year giving the older guests such prime spots. Usually we're stuck by the restrooms." I laughed softly. I think honoring long friendships and the people who shaped our lives makes for a warmer celebration. My voice was easy, almost absent-minded, but every word was deliberate. Before she could reply, the bride stepped out, her expression alert, almost protective. "Oh, I didn't realize you two knew each other." "We're just enjoying the courtyard," I said smoothly, turning to admire the tall arrangements of lilies by the door. "These flowers are stunning. The scent alone could make a person fall in love." Her shoulders eased a fraction. "We worked with a new florist," she said curtly, and without another glance retreated back inside. The aunt gave me a knowing look before excusing herself. The rehearsal wound down with the usual mix of laughter and mild confusion about who stood where. I stayed back, letting others fill the center, content to let my presence be felt without dominating. Near the refreshment table, one of my allies, a retired teacher with a knack for understatement, murmured, "The couple seemed a little tense today. I think tomorrow might be interesting." I just smiled. "It usually is." Another guest, one who'd been shifted closer to the dance floor, joked loudly to no one in particular, "Can't wait for the real show tomorrow." The bride's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at that. Cynthia joined me near the exit, her eyes dancing with restrained amusement. "Groom's side looks off balance," she whispered, "like they just realized you're not a background player." I thought of my late husband's words. The best move is the one they don't see until it's too late. I had no need to push harder tonight. The undercurrent was already there, tugging the room in my direction. I left earlier than most, stepping into the courtyard again as the last golden light of day filtered through the trees. My heels clicked softly on the stone path as I passed under the trellis, the jasmine scent richer now in the cooling air. In my mind, I reviewed the plan for tomorrow. Every placement, every conversation point, every reaction I would give, or withhold, was already set. The board was ready. Tomorrow they'd think they were leading the dance, but I'm the one holding the music. The morning broke clear and cool, sunlight spilling across the driveway as I pulled in well before the main crowd. The stone facade of the venue stood crisp against the sky, its tall arched windows glowing faintly with the first preparations inside. I'd chosen my timing deliberately, early enough to set the rhythm without anyone realizing I was conducting it. Inside, the staff moved briskly, finalizing table placements, adjusting floral sprays, checking silverware. My allies were already here, as planned. Cynthia stood by the entryway, speaking softly to the maitre d'. Across the room, Mr. Palmer and his wife lingered near the stage, scanning their assigned table with approval. They were exactly where I'd placed them, prominent, visible, and impossible to ignore. The bride and groom arrived 15 minutes later. She wore a tight smile, her voice pitched just a bit higher than normal when she greeted me. "Eudora, thank you for coming," she said, as if my absence had ever been a possibility. The groom's handshake was quick, almost perfunctory, his eyes darting toward the reception hall where his groomsmen were gathering. I strolled through the main hall, taking in every detail. The venue might be hosting them today, but it was mine, in deed, in history, and in quiet authority. Guests arriving behind me paused to chat, their greetings warm, their tone just a notch more respectful than with the bridal party. That sort of deference never needed to be demanded. It simply settled in, like sunlight through glass. Cynthia caught my gaze from across the room and gave the slightest nod. The day's quiet execution had begun. The ceremony space was a careful balance of candlelight and cream-colored blooms. I noticed immediately that a few chairs had been angled differently, a subtle adjustment I'd suggested at the rehearsal, creating more open sightlines toward my allies section. As the officiant called everyone to their seats, I caught the bride's mother leaning toward a woman in the second row, her lips moving in a whisper that carried just enough tension to be seen if not heard. The vows began. The groom's voice, steady at first, faltered briefly on one line, forcing a quick glance at the bride. She returned it with a flash of irritation before smoothing her expression. Small things, barely perceptible to most, but to me, they were tells in a game they didn't know they were losing. I kept my smile gentle, my hands folded in my lap. Control the stage, and you control the play. Even here, in the hush of the ceremony, I felt the current running in my direction. A cough from the back, a shifting of shoulders in the front row, people adjusting themselves toward me without even realizing it. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the applause came easily enough, but I noticed whose eyes lingered on me as the couple walked back down the aisle. The reception began with the usual clinking of glasses and murmured congratulations. Plates of hors d'oeuvres circulated, and the first champagne flutes were filled. I stayed near my table, greeting old acquaintances and shaking hands with people I hadn't seen in years. When it came time for the toasts, the groom's best man spoke briefly, a mix of humor and sentiment. Then one of my allies, the retired teacher, rose unexpectedly. Lifting her glass, she said, "Before we continue, I think we all ought to thank Eudora Miller. Without her generosity and vision, this day wouldn't look quite so beautiful." Applause spread in a ripple, genuine and unforced. The bride's smile pulled taut, and for a moment, her eyes fixed on me like she might will the ground to swallow me whole. The groom tried to redirect, thanking the vendors, the planners, even the weather, but the conversation at surrounding tables kept circling back. How I'd helped secure the venue, how I'd known exactly how to arrange certain details. A quiet shift in seating had scattered the bride's closest friends, thinning her inner circle's influence. In contrast, I found myself surrounded by the groom's older relatives, people of standing, leaning in to share stories, asking after my health, recalling shared history. Every interaction strengthened the ground beneath me. It was in the lull between the second course and dessert that the bride found me alone in a side hallway. She stepped in close, voice low but edged. "You're stealing the spotlight. This is my day." I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not here to take anything from you," I said, my tone even. "But I won't let anyone take from me either." Her chin lifted, but her eyes darted toward the sound of approaching footsteps. She knew as well as I did that whatever words came next would be measured against the setting we were in. Cynthia appeared at the end of the hallway, her presence as deliberate as the chime of a clock ending a conversation. "Eudora, they're starting the next toast," she called lightly. I stepped past the bride without haste, brushing her arm just enough to make it feel intentional. Back in the main hall, her smile returned, too bright, a little too fixed, as she rejoined her guests. I didn't need to look to know the tension was still radiating from her. Later, I slipped outside for a breath of cool air. The night had settled in fully now, the venue's lights casting warm pools across the courtyard. Laughter and music floated through the open doors, mingling with the faint scent of the gardenias along the path. I let the sounds wash over me, the shape of the day replaying in my mind. Every detail had unfolded as I'd set it in motion, without a single raised voice, without stepping 1 inch outside the bounds of civility. Tomorrow they'd remember the vows, but they'd never forget who owned the room. The reception was in full swing, the air thick with the scent of buttercream and champagne. Music pulsed softly beneath the chatter of guests. Laughter rose in pockets, but beneath it all, I could hear the quieter currents, the murmurs, the side glances, the subtle shifts in who was speaking to whom. It was the kind of atmosphere where everyone pretended everything was perfect, but the truth traveled faster than the canapés. From my seat near the gift table, I could see it starting. A pair of women in pastel dresses leaned toward each other, eyes flicking in my direction before they whispered again. A man in a navy blazer stood near the bar, gesturing with his glass toward me as he spoke to his wife. Cynthia, across the room, caught my eye and tilted her head just enough for me to understand. The right people were listening, and the right people were talking. The bride moved through the crowd, her gown swishing behind her. She was careful to avoid looking directly at me, but her shoulders were a little too stiff. The groom, on the other hand, turned the charm up too high, laughing a beat too loud, holding handshakes too long. I'd seen this before, people trying to keep a lid on something they couldn't quite contain. I took a slow sip of my champagne and waited. Eventually, the band fell silent and the bride tapped a microphone. The room's attention shifted. She stood beneath the string lights, her smile fixed in place. "I just want to thank those who really made today possible," she began, her voice sugary but strained. She listed names, her parents, the planner, the caterer, even a friend who'd arranged the flowers. But not mine. I let her finish without a blink. But before the polite applause could take over, a voice cut in from one of the tables near the front. "And of course, Mrs. Miller, the woman who owns this beautiful place." The words hung in the air, amplified by the sudden hush. Murmurs spread like ripples in a pond. Heads turned toward me, curiosity sharpening their expressions. The omission wasn't just noticeable now. It was glaring. I rose slowly, glass in hand. "I appreciate the kind words," I said, my tone even but carrying through the room. "Today is about celebrating love, family, and the generosity that makes moments like this possible. I'm proud to have played my part alongside so many of you in making this day one to remember." I included her parents in my gaze, the planner, and finally myself, an acknowledgement no one could edit out. The groom shifted on his feet, his smile slipping for half a second. The bride's jaw tightened before she clapped lightly, forcing the crowd back into motion. I sat down again, unhurried, and let the moment settle exactly where it needed to. A few songs later, she approached me with a bright voice. "It's so warm in here," she said. "Want to step out for some fresh air?" It wasn't a question. We slipped out into the courtyard. The night air was cooler, scented faintly with roses and the lingering smoke from the patio heaters. She turned to face me, her expression stripped of any wedding day charm. "You're trying to humiliate me," she said flatly. "On my wedding day." I held her gaze. "Respect is never given freely," I replied, my voice low enough to make her lean in. "It's earned, and it can be taken back just as easily." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You think because you have money and connections, you can just—" I don't think, I cut in softly. I know. And what I do with that is entirely dependent on how people choose to treat me. The mask slipped further. Bitterness edged her words. You've always looked down on me. I didn't take the bait. I simply listened, letting her fill the space with every grievance she'd rehearsed. When she finally fell silent, the sound of laughter from inside reached us again, a reminder that the audience was still there, and we both knew the performance would have to resume. I stepped back into the reception first, the hum of music and conversation wrapping around me like a familiar coat. My pace was steady, my smile easy. The contrast was immediate, my calm versus her forced cheerfulness when she rejoined the crowd. Near the dessert table, a tall man with silver hair approached. Mrs. Miller, he said warmly, I just wanted to tell you how graciously you've handled today. A real class act. His voice was loud enough to carry to the nearby tables. I inclined my head. That's kind of you to say. From the corner of my eye, I saw the bride stiffen, her champagne glass pausing halfway to her lips. Cynthia appeared beside me then, guiding me to a seat that faced the entire room, just a few feet from the towering stack of wrapped gifts. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was impossible to miss. The groom's parents drifted over, their faces alight. We were just saying, his mother began, how lucky the family is to have you. You've been wonderful. I met her gaze and smiled. Family is everything, I said simply, knowing the bride was close enough to hear every word. An hour before the reception was due to end, I stood and gathered my things. My departure was deliberate, unhurried, the kind of exit that made people wonder why. As I walked toward the doors, I caught snippets of conversation, the threads weaving themselves into the tapestry I'd been building all evening. You can tell who really runs this family, a woman near the coat rack whispered to her companion. They both glanced in my direction. Outside, the night was still. I breathed it in, the cool air sharp in my lungs. I didn't need to win an argument. I'd already won the room, and tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning after the wedding dawned bright and crisp, sunlight spilling over the garden terrace of the venue. White tablecloths fluttered in the soft breeze, and crystal glasses caught the light like tiny prisms. The brunch had been set up to feel intimate, only close family and a few select friends, all seated around a long table lined with flowers that looked as if they had been plucked fresh that morning. I arrived early, as I always did, wearing a soft cream suit and a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. Cynthia was already there, moving between the servers and the floral arrangements, making sure everything was perfect. In her hand was a slim leather portfolio, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it contained. The bride and groom came in together, smiling far too widely for it to be genuine. I knew the type. They thought the awkwardness of last night had cooled overnight, that a polite brunch could smooth things over. They greeted guests with warmth that felt just a little desperate. When they reached me, the bride clasped my hand as if we'd been close all along. Eudora, I'm so glad you came, she said. Of course, I replied with the kind of warmth you reserve for someone you've already decided to outmaneuver. Around us, a few guests were murmuring about how gracious I was to attend after all that tension yesterday. I simply smiled and took my seat at the head of the table. The calm was deliberate, a still lake before the storm. We had just finished our coffee refills when I rose, lifting my glass in a small toast. I want to thank everyone here, I began, my voice steady. It's a rare thing for family to gather, to celebrate, and to share in moments that will be remembered for years to come. Nods around the table, polite smiles. I let the warmth linger just long enough. And in that spirit of gratitude, I continued, I want to share some news. As of today, I will be transferring ownership of this beautiful venue, but not, I paused deliberately, to the newlyweds. The words sliced through the morning air like a clean blade. A ripple of surprise moved down the table. The groom's fork clattered against his plate. He coughed, choking briefly on his drink. Instead, I announced, The venue will belong to the Miller Charitable Trust, which I established to fund scholarships for women over the age of 60, women who, like me, know that new chapters aren't just for the young. There were audible gasps. A cousin across the table pressed a hand to her mouth. The bride's complexion drained, leaving her looking almost translucent in the bright sun. She didn't speak. Couldn't. I gestured to Cynthia, who opened the leather portfolio, sliding the documents onto the table. "Everything has been finalized," I said, signing my name with a practiced flourish. A notary, waiting discreetly nearby, stepped forward to witness and stamp the pages. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper seemed louder than it should have been. I handed the signed stack to the notary, who slipped it into a sealed envelope. "It's done," I said simply, taking my seat again as if nothing unusual had happened. The silence was brittle, but I wasn't finished. I placed my coffee cup down gently. "While we're speaking openly, I have one more update." My tone was even, but the room felt as if it had tilted toward me. "As of this morning," I continued, "I have ended all financial support to the couple, completely. No more monthly stipends, no more access to family accounts, no more covering expenses." I reached into my handbag and withdrew a second set of documents. "And here," I said, sliding them toward the middle of the table, "is my updated will. You'll see I've removed both of you as beneficiaries. That space has been filled by people and causes who've shown me respect and loyalty." The bride found her voice then, though it cracked on the way out. "You can't just—" I held up a hand. "I can. And I did. You wanted me gone from your life. I'm granting your wish. Completely." The groom's eyes darted to his parents, who sat frozen. Then I added, almost conversationally, "And before you try to twist this, everything I've done is documented. Photos, text messages, witness statements, even the things you thought no one noticed." Across the table, a longtime family friend cleared his throat. "Frankly, Eudora," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you're doing the right thing. Actions have consequences, and you've shown more patience than most would have." His words landed like the final nail in a coffin. The bride's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The groom stared at the tablecloth as if willing it to swallow him whole. I stood then, smoothing the front of my jacket. "Cynthia," I said, leaning down to kiss her cheek, "thank you for your help." She smiled knowingly. Without waiting for dessert, I walked toward the terrace steps. Behind me, murmurs swelled, not in my direction, but toward the couple. Phrases like "ungrateful" and "she deserved better" floated on the air. The bride slumped in her chair, her posture crumbling now that the performance was over. The groom stayed very still, his gaze locked on his untouched plate. Cynthia remained just long enough to ensure every document was properly filed, speaking briefly with the notary before leaving to join me. Back in my private office, I set my handbag on the desk and poured myself a cup of tea. The window framed the gardens outside, sunlight dancing across the petals and trimmed hedges. I let myself breathe it in, the quiet, the certainty, the clean finality of it all. They had tried to write me out of their story. Instead, I had written the ending. Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who honors your presence. I took a slow sip of tea, watching a few brunch guests trickle out below, their heads close together in hushed conversation. They may have had their wedding, but I had the last word, and the last laugh.